Let us walk slowly through the pages of history, not to admire the past, but to understand how it shaped the ground we stand on today. America did not begin in innocence. It began with a contradiction. The same land that declared all men were created equal was tilled by hands bound in chains. Slavery was not a flaw in the system. From the red clay of Georgia to the tobacco fields of Virginia, enslaved Africans built the wealth of a rising republic. Cotton, rice, sugar, these weren't just crops, they were currencies. And the bodies that harvested them were not just laborers, they were capital, owned, traded, dehumanized. The economy of the United States, its railroads, its banks, even the ivory towers of its universities, benefited from this forced labor. Some of the first insurance policies written in this country were written not for buildings or ships, but for enslaved human beings. This wasn't confined to the South. Northern mills spun Southern cotton into profit. Wall Street itself grew stronger on the back of slavery's commerce. And in the halls of Congress, compromises were struck not to end the institution, but to preserve it, because it was profitable, and because it was deeply embedded in the national fabric. And yet, in that dark soil of bondage, something else was growing. Resistance. Enslaved people were not silent. They were not broken. They carried with them the wisdom of their ancestors, the rhythms of Africa, the strength of generations. They told stories, passed down songs, taught their children to hope even in the shadows. Some ran, some fought. Some learned to read in secret, to write, to preach, to dream. And in each act of defiance, large or small, they declared a truth the nation refused to hear, that they were human, and they would not be forgotten. We often speak of the founding fathers and the principles of liberty, but it is time we speak also of the unnamed founders. Those who cleared the fields, raised the crops, built the homes, and birthed the wealth of this country. Those whose names were never written in history books, but whose sweat and suffering made history possible. They were founders too. Not by choice, but by endurance. When the Civil War came, it didn't just tear a country apart. It forced the country to look into a mirror. And in that mirror was the truth, that freedom and slavery had grown together, side by side. One could no longer pretend the other did not exist. Emancipation came, but it was not the end. The chains were broken, yes, but the shadows remained. Sharecropping, Jim Crow, redlining, mass incarceration, each a new chapter in an old story. Still, the people who had been enslaved never stopped pushing forward. Their descendants became teachers, artists, soldiers, inventors, leaders. They built churches, fought in wars, marched for justice. They wrote new pages in America's story, pages full of resilience, resistance, and renewal. And so here we are, generations later, still walking roads paved by that past. We feel it in our cities, in our schools, in our laws. We hear it in the echoes of old pain and the voices of new movements. We live with the legacy of slavery, not just in history books, but in real, everyday inequality. But if slavery helped build America, then the memory of those who were enslaved must help rebuild it. We cannot move forward without looking back, not to stay there, but to understand what we carry with us. The pain, the endurance, the truth. This isn't about blame. It's about honesty. It's about seeing clearly what so many for so long were told to forget. It's about recognizing that history doesn't disappear. It waits. It waits to be acknowledged, to be faced, to be learned from. Because the real story of America is not just one of power. It is also one of struggle. It is the story of a people who were stolen from their homes, forced into bondage, and yet still found ways to believe in freedom, long before it believed in them. They are part of the making of America. Their story is not beneath the surface. It is the surface. And only when we tell it with truth and with dignity can this nation hope to live up to the promises it made on paper so long ago. The story of slavery is not over. It lives on, not in chains, but in choices. And it is up to us to decide what will we do with that inheritance. Will we deny it, or will we use it to build something more just, more free, and more honest than ever before? Slavery was not a chapter America could turn the page on. It was the very binding of the book. Too often, it is discussed as a Southern anomaly or a moral failing that existed at the margins of an otherwise noble project. But the truth is more uncomfortable and far more revealing. Slavery was not peripheral to America's formation. It was foundational from the colonial settlements of the 17th century through the rise of industrial capitalism in the 19th. Slavery was the engine that powered economic growth and institutional development across the entire country. The image of enslaved people picking cotton under the sun is etched into our collective memory, but the full scope of slavery's influence extends far beyond the fields. The tobacco plantations of Virginia, the rice paddies of South Carolina, and later the vast cotton fields of the Deep South produced not just crops, they produced capital. This capital did not stay in the South. It moved through the veins of a growing national economy. Cotton was shipped to textile mills in New England, which relied on that supply chain to thrive. Northern banks and insurance companies financed the slave trade and underwrote slaveholding as a form of property. Even some of the oldest and most prestigious universities in America were built with funds, directly or indirectly, tied to slavery's profits. This system wasn't accidental. It was crafted, maintained, and defended at the highest levels of government. Laws were written to preserve the ownership of human beings. The Constitution itself, hailed as a beacon of liberty, contained clauses that protected the interests of slaveholders and institutionalized the dehumanization of black people. 3/5 of a person, not as a symbolic insult, but as a political calculation. The founding ideals of freedom, equality, and democracy were laid upon a foundation where millions were denied even their humanity. The contradiction is glaring. Yet it is part of the country's DNA. Slavery also helped define American labor and class structures. It set precedents for how workers would be controlled, how racial divisions would be used to prevent solidarity, and how profit could be extracted with no regard for human cost. The logic of exploitation, maximizing gain by minimizing freedom, was tested and perfected on the backs of enslaved Africans. That same logic would later manifest in factories, mines, and sweatshops across the industrializing nation. Moreover, slavery didn't merely contribute to America's wealth, it helped shape its institutions. The U.S. legal system had to develop ways to regulate ownership of human beings, to punish rebellion, to track fugitives. The policing system in many southern cities began as slave patrols. Federal policies like the Fugitive Slave Act compelled even free states to participate in the system. Slavery infiltrated not just the economy, but the very architecture of national governance. And yet, this foundational role is often downplayed in textbooks and political speeches and in public memory. To truly understand how America became what it is, we must confront the truth that slavery was not a deviation from American ideals. It was a shaping force. The wealth accumulated, the cities built, the markets opened, the power structures established. Much of it came at the cost of bondage. The lives of enslaved people were not lost on the periphery of history. They were central to the American story. When we erase that, or sanitize it, we do more than disrespect the past. We misunderstand the present. Because the inequality we see today, the racial disparities, the structural injustices, all trace back to that foundation. Slavery didn't just build America. It defined the terms on which it was built, and until we reckon with that fact, honestly and fully, we will always be building on a fault line. As America was crafting its identity as a land of freedom, justice, and democracy, it was simultaneously sustaining a system that denied those very ideals to millions. This contradiction lies at the core of the nation's birth. The same era that gave rise to powerful declarations about liberty and the rights of man was also the age of plantation slavery, racial subjugation, and human commodification. Slavery and democracy did not exist in separate spheres. They were deeply intertwined, growing together, feeding off each other in ways that shaped the moral and political landscape of the United States. The Founding Fathers, so often praised for their vision of liberty, lived in a world where owning other human beings was both legally sanctioned and socially accepted. Some of them, including Jefferson and Washington, were slaveholders themselves. They could write eloquently about freedom while living off the forced labor of those denied it. The ideals enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were in practice reserved for a narrow segment of society: white, male, and property owning. Enslaved Africans were excluded from this vision, not by oversight, but by design. This coexistence of liberty and bondage wasn't just a moral flaw, it was a structural choice. The political unity of the new nation depended on it. The Constitution protected slavery in multiple ways, from the Three-Fifths Compromise to the continuation of the Atlantic slave trade for 20 years after ratification. Southern states would not have joined the Union without guarantees that their property would be protected. In this way, slavery became embedded not only in the economy but in the very framework of American governance. The compromise between freedom and slavery was not a temporary arrangement. It was foundational. This tension between American ideals and American practice gave rise to a paradox that continues to haunt the nation. How could a society claim to be a beacon of freedom while profiting from the enslavement of millions? The answer for much of history was to rationalize slavery through racist ideology. Pseudoscience, religion, and law were all used to argue that black people were inherently inferior, unfit for citizenship, and better off in bondage. These beliefs weren't fringe. They were mainstream, woven into school curricula, court rulings, and sermons. Racial hierarchy became the glue that held the contradiction together. It allowed Americans to champion freedom while denying it to others. The result was a democracy that was, from its very inception, limited by race. Citizenship, voting rights, legal protections, all were restricted by skin color. And when slavery finally ended, the system did not transform into full equality. Instead, new structures were built to preserve white supremacy. Black codes, Jim Crow laws, voter suppression, and segregation. The machinery of democracy had been built to exclude, and changing that machinery would prove a long and painful struggle. But, despite the hypocrisy, enslaved and oppressed people never stopped demanding the rights promised in America's founding documents. Abolitionists, both black and white, called out the contradictions. Frederick Douglass famously asked, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" Enslaved people themselves resisted with courage and intelligence, forcing the nation to face its contradictions. Their resistance, through rebellion, escape, education, and organizing, pushed American democracy to begin living up to its own rhetoric. Even today, the legacies of that original contradiction are still visible. Disparities in wealth, education, incarceration, and political representation are not accidental. They are the echoes of a system that defined democracy by race. To understand American democracy, we must understand that it was born alongside slavery, shaped by it, and tested by those who fought to expand its meaning. True democracy in America has always been a struggle, not a given. And it was the people who were denied its rights who most clearly revealed its potential. They saw through the hypocrisy and still believed in the promise. That belief, and the fight to make it real, is what has pushed the country forward. To understand slavery solely through the lens of suffering is to miss a crucial part of the story: the strength, defiance, and enduring humanity of the enslaved themselves. While the system was designed to strip them of agency, dignity, and hope, enslaved Africans and their descendants resisted in ways both visible and invisible. They were not silent victims of history. They were active participants in shaping it. Through rebellion, cultural survival, intellectual pursuit, and everyday acts of resistance, they fought to reclaim their identity and their future. From the moment enslaved people were forced onto ships and transported across the Atlantic, resistance began. Some chose death over bondage, leaping into the ocean rather than submit to a life in chains. Others organized revolts aboard the ships. Once in the Americas, resistance took many forms. Open rebellions like the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina or Nat Turner's Uprising in Virginia shook the foundations of the slaveholding society. These were not isolated events. They were reminders that, even under the most brutal conditions, human beings would fight for their freedom. But resistance was not always dramatic or large-scale. In fact, much of it occurred in the everyday lives of the enslaved. Slowing down work, breaking tools, feigning illness. These were subtle forms of defiance that disrupted the efficiency of the plantation economy. Enslaved people used music, storytelling, and religion as tools of psychological survival and quiet rebellion. Spirituals, for instance, often carried hidden messages. Songs that spoke of freedom and escape, veiled behind biblical language. These coded expressions helped sustain hope, community, and resistance without drawing the punishment of their oppressors. Culture became a battlefield where enslaved people refused to be erased. Despite laws that tried to prevent literacy, many secretly learned to read and write, knowing that knowledge was power. Enslaved parents taught their children history, values, and pride in their African heritage. They created new cultural forms, blending African, indigenous, and European influences, to craft a unique identity that could survive slavery and carry forward into the future. These cultural traditions, music, cuisine, language, and spirituality still resonate in African American life today, a testament to the creativity and resilience born under oppression. Some resisted by fleeing. The Underground Railroad, with figures like Harriet Tubman and countless unnamed helpers, became a symbol of organized resistance. Escape was perilous, but many were willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. Those who escaped often returned to help others, turning personal liberation into collective action. In northern cities, freed black communities formed schools, churches, mutual aid societies, and abolitionist networks. They became the political backbone of the movement to end slavery. Intellectual resistance also played a vital role. Enslaved and formerly enslaved writers like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Olaudah Equiano told their stories to the world, shattering myths of black inferiority and exposing the moral bankruptcy of slavery. Their voices traveled across continents, igniting debate, stirring empathy, and helping to build international pressure against the institution. What's vital to remember is that this resistance was not just about fighting against something. It was about preserving something. Enslaved people fought to preserve family, culture, memory, and hope. They refused to let slavery define them, even when the world refused to see their humanity. Their resistance became the moral core of the abolitionist struggle and planted the seeds for later movements, civil rights, black liberation, and justice reform. So when we talk about slavery, we must talk not only about chains, but about courage. Not only about suffering, but about strength. The enslaved were not powerless. They were powerful in ways that reshaped America from the inside out. Their resistance wasn't just survival. It was the beginning of a deeper freedom, one still being pursued today. The legacy of slavery in America did not end with the Emancipation Proclamation or the close of the Civil War. The chains were broken, but the structure that held them remained. Slavery, in its original form, may have been abolished, but its echoes have shaped every generation since. From laws and institutions to culture and consciousness, the past has never truly passed. To understand the inequalities and divisions that still trouble American society, one must confront the living legacy of slavery and how it continues to shape the present. After emancipation, freedom was promised, but not delivered. Formerly enslaved people were thrown into a society that denied them land, education, legal protection, and basic dignity. The period of Reconstruction briefly held the possibility of real change, with African Americans voting, holding office, and building communities. But this progress was violently reversed. White supremacist groups, discriminatory laws, and systemic disenfranchisement took the place of physical change. Sharecropping replaced plantation slavery with a new form of economic bondage. Black codes, and later Jim Crow laws, enforced racial segregation and subordination in every aspect of life. The criminal justice system became a key tool in continuing the control of black bodies. Convict leasing allowed states to arrest black men on minor or fabricated charges and force them into unpaid labor, often under worse conditions than slavery itself. Prisons replaced plantations, but the logic of exploitation remained. This system laid the groundwork for the mass incarceration crisis that persists today, disproportionately affecting the passing of time. The prison position of black boss in America and people of color, education, housing, healthcare, and employment. Every major institution has inherited the legacy of racial inequality. Redlining policies in the 20th century denied black families access to home ownership and generational wealth. Segregated schools, underfunded and overcrowded, kept children from receiving equal opportunities. Healthcare disparities resulted in higher mortality rates and shorter life expectancy. And in the workforce, discrimination limited access to high-paying jobs and fair wages. These disparities are not accidental. They are the result of historical patterns, laws, customs, and policies designed to exclude and control. They are the aftershocks of an institution that was never fully dismantled, only reshaped. And they continue to fuel mistrust, division, and injustice in American life. But the legacy of slavery is not only about what was done to black people. It's also about what the rest of society learned to ignore. Generations grew up believing in a version of history that erased or minimized slavery's role in building the country. Textbooks sanitized the past. Memorials honored those who defended slavery while silencing those who endured it. The result is a national amnesia that makes honest reckoning difficult and that delays the healing a divided nation so desperately needs. Yet truth has a way of rising. Scholars, artists, activists, and educators have worked tirelessly to uncover and share the full story. The push for reparations, the demand for police reform, the protests against racial violence, these are not isolated movements. They are part of a larger struggle to address the unfinished business of slavery. To move forward, America must look backward, not in shame, but in clarity. Understanding the legacy of slavery is not about guilt. It is about responsibility. It is about recognizing that history shapes the present, and that the wounds of the past must be acknowledged before they can be healed. Only by facing the truth can a nation begin to live up to its ideals, not just in words but in practice. Slavery may be over, but its legacy lives on. And until that legacy is addressed, the promise of true freedom remains incomplete.